Welcome back to Count Me In, IMA's podcast about all things affecting the accounting and finance world. I am your host, Adam Larson. I'm here to bring you episode 84 of our series. Today's feature presenter is founder and CEO of Strategy Titan, Jason Krantz. Strategy Titan is a strategic management, data, and analytics advisory firm. And Jason is a business professional with over 10 years of business analytics, data science, and strategic leadership experience. In this episode, he shares his perspective on data, analytics, and strategy, and he explains how these functions of the organization need to ultimately drive your overall business strategy. Jason talks about the products that have great opportunity to increase your firm's revenue by connecting these strategies and how aligning your business's strategies helps mitigate risk. Keep listening, and we'll now head over to a very insightful and analytical conversation.
All right. So Jason, we were having a brief conversation before we started here. And, we were talking a lot about the importance and the value of this conversation. So to start us off, why is a data and analytics strategy so important for innovation today?
Yeah, in my mind, really what it does is it gets down to identifying opportunities that are going to move the needle strategically and financially. All of us have financial goals, revenue goals, growth goals, whatever it may be. I'll just give a real example. I like to use examples to illustrate these concepts, to move them from fuzzy to concrete. I used to work for a company. $2 billion company. We were an industry consolidator, so we acquired numerous companies. We had everybody on different ERP platforms, something I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. Each company really had a different behavior profile on the way that they did things. So me being standing up an analytics practice in this company, one of my first jobs was to consolidate all this information and start looking at it, look for opportunities. Now, we had pretty big EBITDA growth goals. We were entirely focused on EBITDA growth as our strategic objectives. And so as we're looking through this, we find out that we have well over $10 million in uncollected freight. Now, this is freight that we're owed, so we just had not gone out and collected it. And as we looked at it, started asking questions saying, hey, why is it that we do this? Like, oh, well, it's in our contract that we can do this, but we typically let it go, or, it's just, we've done it this way for so long. So every company was doing it a different way, but the common theme was this freight recovery. So as we looked at it, we're like, we can actually make about $14 million if we just collect the freight that we're owed. Not only, let's not even account for, freight increases for, gas, whatever it may be, surcharges. And as we brought this to the management team, they're like, how could this be? And as we got everybody aligned behind it, they said, this is a serious opportunity. This is a process improvement opportunity. This is real money that will impact the bottom line and help us meet our objectives. Now, the reason I share that story is analytics by itself didn't do anything. We didn't actually collect that money or drive that force forward. But what it did is it served as a tool to identify the opportunity that if we never would have gone through that process, we never would have identified that opportunity. We would not have socialized it and gotten everybody to see, wow, this is something very significant. And a lot of times growth comes from, looking outside for new initiatives or whatever it may be. But a lot of times, and I've seen this time and time again, a lot of times there's opportunities sitting right underneath our noses. I call these piles of money just sitting around waiting to be picked up. And it's one of these things where this insight, it wasn't anything revolutionary, but it was very significant in that it could help us move the financial needle. And that's what gets me excited about analytics and data, is its ability to identify concrete opportunities like that to help improve business results. It's not all ponies and unicorns. This is real stuff.
So I just want to pause for 1 second. You just said analytics and data. And for clarification, my first question, I did ask data and analytics. So what I would like to do is, for our listeners, if you can offer a distinction and define the difference between data and analytics, like we're talking about, and data analytics in your perspective.
Yeah, sure. Great question. So, I separate data and analytics as I see them as being vastly different topics. Now, I will fully admit up front, these are my biases. These are the ways that I view the world. It's not saying it's necessarily correct, quote unquote. But for me, data has a much heavier infrastructure and asset management perspective to me. Now, I say asset management because I do look at data as an asset. I know it's not on the balance sheet as an intangible asset, but it is. Our accounting rules have not evolved, but I think we will get to that point. So things like master data management, governance, security, database management, and other back-end activities, these are really important. But from my perspective, they mean little to the strategic side of the equation from the perspective of the business. Now, again, that's not to say that it's not important. Data breaches, things we've all seen, those are extremely serious things. But it's a different process where analytics is more front end and strategy focused to me. The business is extremely interested in that. So that's why I look at these things as two totally separate things. The analogy I use is, it's very cliche, but data is oil, and then the analytics process is plastic. Oil serves as the raw material to make a bunch of different things out of plastic. And in the same way, data serves as a raw material to do all sorts of strategic analytic and business analytic things. But in both cases, you can't have that end product without the raw material. So the process, though, of sourcing and transforming that raw material is a process in and of itself. So getting that oil and transforming it is a process. Getting the data, storing it, transforming it is a process. But then the design, creation, marketing, sales, and distribution of those end products, that analytics process is totally different. Data analytics, to me, conveys a heavier focus on the mechanics of analysis. And so just for me, I prefer to take a very heavy output in business results perspective, because what I've observed is that if we focus on the mechanics, it tends to be harder to be effective with kind of the implementation of these findings and drive strategy, drive results, and persuade people to do things different.
All right. Thank you for clarifying that. I think it makes total sense, and I appreciate your distinction there. And now we're going to kind of take a step forward with all that in mind. Why does this strategy really need to be an executive or even board level topic, depending on our audience? Why is this such a valuable topic to be discussed?
Yeah. So I would say one thing is it depends on your industry, right? As always, it depends. But I would say for most industries, at least the industries I work in, manufacturing, wholesale trade, kind of industrial, what I call dirtier industries in general, and I'll say in general, very broad brushstroke, they tend to be less further along on the data and analytics maturation curve. Manufacturing, let's use as an example. Within the four walls, they're incredibly skilled at that. You got your Kanban, Six Sigma, continual improvement, all these different things that within the four walls are very well-oiled machines. These are things they've been doing since World War I, I think. But when you look outside your four walls, that process tends to be far less developed. And in a lot of what, at least I've done in my career in manufacturing and wholesale trade and industrial, a lot of the significant value has been derived from looking at those things outside the four walls. And the reason why I kind of preface my response with that is that if you're used to looking within the four walls, you need to build a new innovation and mindset and strategic muscles to really start looking at what can we do outside of our four walls. And that's a big muscle to build because we're creatures of habit. We do things that we're familiar with. Change is hard. So as we look at this as an executive or board level topic, the reason why it's important is because I personally see this as being one of the most effective approaches for identifying and creating new and innovative strategies. It's the raw materials for understanding your markets better. It's really important for deploying your resources effectively and mitigating risk. And when I say deploying resources effectively, it gets down to that ROI equation. What are the strategic items that you have on your agenda? What is the risk associated with those? What is the potential return? But sometimes, and I've observed this time and time in my career, which is why I'm so passionate about this, sometimes there will be strategic opportunities that are very significant, extremely low risk, that are right underneath our noses, and we might not even be aware of them. And I go back to that freight example. That is a real example that I've seen play out time and time and time again in multiple organizations. It's almost like, well, how, you assume that you're doing these things, but if nobody really looks at it, or, another great example is a total cost to serve for your customer base. Like, okay, you've got your gross margin, your contribution margin, material margin, but what's your, after you look at all that stuff, what's your total cost to serve for your customer base? Most companies will be blown away to observe that most of those customers that they thought they were probably making a lot of money on, after you account for all things like freight being a part of that equation, you could actually be losing significant sums of money. And again, I say that just because I personally have observed that. That's how I've made a career out of this stuff, is finding these things that they're not crazy, they're not revolutionary, and as a result, they're not the sexiest thing in the world, but for a lot of executive or teams or boards, these can move the needle in major ways, and they don't require massive ERP implementations or massive big bang projects. They can be started and piloted quite quickly and easily, but they can develop like unusually huge ROI if done appropriately.
And let's talk strategy a little bit here. We've mentioned data and analytics strategy a couple times. What's actually included in this strategy? Can you walk us through what the process looks like of creating a data and analytics strategy?
Yeah. So my approach, again, it depends on where a company is at in their life cycle. Are they in turnaround mode? Is it a younger company looking for growth? Most of the companies that I have been in have been more mature organizations. So I will preface it by saying that I approach it from that lens. But many of the times, the companies that I've been a part of, and most companies, I think, have strategic goals related to revenue growth, EBITDA growth, market share gain, things like that. So as we're looking at this, I tend to look at it as, what are those projects that have probably or what are those areas that have low analytical sophistication, have significant upside in terms of we can get up the analytics curve quickly? What is going to be those projects that are most likely to get people excited and show the potential of data and analytics? And then most importantly, which projects are most likely to actually physically move the financial needle, either directly or indirectly? And I'll give you some examples. One of my favorites to go after is sales analytics along with pricing analytics, because these two are extremely closely related. Pricing analytics is something that can directly impact revenue and EBITDA growth. It's the most powerful profit lever we have. But there's complexity that goes into that. As you know, sales incentive plans, comp plans, all these different factors go into effectively deploying a price increase and being successful in that price increase without shedding business. So that one introduces a very significant human component, as most analytics projects do. We don't, for the sake of time, we're not going to dig into that, but that's a very significant, it's actually probably the most significant challenge in an analytics initiative is the people side of it and the change and the culture related to it. But focusing on the projects themselves right now, the sales analytics is one that I personally always start with. Always. Because I found time and time again that if you can help revenue drivers do better and do their jobs better with less work, everybody benefits from that. So, I'll give you an example. One organization that I went into to start up an analytics capability, sales reps are spending 5 hours a week putting together various types of report, either for their customers or preparing for meetings or whatever it could be. As we look at that, we're like, wow, we have 80 reps. So, that's a lot of time every single week putting into a no value add activity for a sales rep, right? If you're a sales rep and you're creating reports, that's opportunity cost that you're not out selling. So it's like, okay, well, if you have revenue growth goals and market share growth goals. You're going to have to sell more. Sell more requires more prospecting, but there's a finite amount of time. So if one of our objectives is to sell more, what if we could put together this analytics platform to free up the time so that sales reps aren't putting together reports anymore? We're automatically delivering standardized content to them on a regular basis that they can deploy to their customers or use for internal reporting purposes. We create that standard. Not only that, a lot of times there will be errors through no fault of their own. Maybe a filter is wrong in a pivot, or whatever it could be. There's a variety of situations. But what we're doing is we're taking that time, and this is one of these things that the 5 hours a week, as an illustration, happens every single week. Let's say it doesn't go away, and it probably gets worse during strategic planning cycles, annual operating plans, budgets, all that stuff. So what we're doing is you're taking every single week then that fictional 5 hours, and you're reallocating it to selling, which should help you hit your goals of more sales growth, more revenue, whatever it may be. So that's just one example of how it can be used as a tool to free people up to do the things that you hired them to do, right? You hired a sales team to sell, whether it's farmers or hunters, whatever it may be. You hired them to sell, not do reports. And then, by creating the standardized perspective around the numbers and the views that you take, everybody starts to speak the same language, and they understand more intuitively what the other party is doing because everybody's looking at the same thing. And this is an example of one of those. It sounds extremely simple and common sense, and it is, but I've observed it's remarkably rare in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, that makes total sense once again. And I'm going to keep this conversation moving forward here one more step. We looked at the analytics strategy from, you mentioned different departments, right? The different functions of a business. But how do these different strategies ultimately drive the overall business strategy for the organization then?
Sure. Great question. So this is one of those where, let's take a fictional organization, and again, they have the goal of revenue growth. Okay, so now what happens is by having kind of this standardized framework, this understanding that you've got this team quarterbacking this effort, right? That in my mind, that's the benefit of having an analytics team or an organization within. Or I'm sorry, a group within the organization that is responsible for quarterbacking these efforts. Because what they can do then is they can take care of a lot of the stuff, right? Some organizations try it out and they put the analytics function in IT. Frequently, though, at least in the people that I've talked to in my experience, that's one that runs into a hurdle very quickly because so much communication across the organization and coordination across the organization has to happen that this team, it really has to be involved in all components of the business, right? Again, using the manufacturing example. If you've got a revenue growth goal that has sales, management team in terms of sales incentive plans, are you comping people based on revenue, profitability, whatever it is? It takes coordination on that front. On the sales side, it gets people to understand their comp plans and track performance against those goals. If you're manufacturing something, it takes coordination with operations to make sure you've got the capacity to make the stuff that you're selling, right? With finance, it comes into coordinating with finance to understand, along with operations and others, this is the product mix that we're going to bring to the table. This is the margin profile of that. All these different pieces that come together, but that piece of working together is really what gives the analytical power, gives it its oomph, because that coordination is where it's getting everybody on the same page to march together to address these key strategic agendas. In this example, revenue growth. It takes a lot to get everybody on the same page. And in my mind, the data and analytics creates a common language, a common view, a common framework and approach for identifying opportunities, executing against those, and tracking success. But it's really, again, I get back to that point of having that one group that is responsible for quarterbacking that is so massively important, because if you do not have that, then what you have is well, you're taking care of this. Well, you're taking care of this. Well, you're taking care of this. Nobody's responsible for it. As a result, nothing gets done. And then your analytics initiatives, they get a bad name. no individual entity's fault, but they've got competing priorities. So if you have that entity that is responsible for driving the strategic agenda through analytics, in conjunction with everybody else, I think you've got a winning formula.
All right, so I'm going to jump ahead into our last question here for our conversation, and this really is kind of what prompted, us ultimately getting together on this call and having this conversation here. We talked about the different strategies and what that means. So, how does the marriage of these strategies ultimately mitigate organizational risks and really, enhance the opportunity for the organization to succeed?
Sure. Again, this depends on the individual entity, but I'll give you one example using pricing, right? So from a risk perspective, there's a lot of dry powder on the M&A front sitting on the sidelines. Industry consolidation is extremely common across a number of industries, and it's going to probably, as you get more distressed businesses coming forward, it's probably going to be even more. Now, one of the things, especially for larger companies, as they're acquiring, is to be cognizant of the pricing exposure. So let's take an example. Let's take customer X is, let's call it Walmart. You're selling a widget to Walmart for $1. And let's say that there is a customer that Walmart just acquired that you're selling to for that same widget for 90 cents. Now, that little company that Walmart just acquired buys 1/1000th of the volume that they've got. But now Walmart buys them and says, hey, wait, you're giving this company a 10-cent better price than us? You know what? We want that price. So now as you're looking at this, you have legitimate pricing exposure risk to the tune of ungodly sums of money due to poor price management, right? And I use the pricing one just because I think that's extremely common. If you sell something, you have pricing. And while that exact example could be unique to manufacturing, I'm sure there's some lesson in there. It could be teased out to other industries. But the idea is that risk mitigation, there's that type of risk mitigation where you've got a kind of exposure due to a poor process control or whatever it may be. But it's also that when you're marching into a project, by going through the due diligence using an analytical framework and data, right? Gut feel is very valuable, but gut feel is even more valuable if you supplement it with data and analytics. You could have a better understanding of the risk profile associated with a particular project than maybe you would if you didn't do that. And I'll give another example using pricing again, is that, price increases typically are met with fear. People fear that business is going to be put at risk, whatever it may be. And this is a real example that I've done numerous times in my past job. With e-commerce channel becoming more and more prevalent, that's a good thing, but it also brings pricing transparency. So let's say you're going to go do a price increase and you sell the widget for $100 and you're going to increase it to $120, let's say, again, for illustrative purposes. So now you've got a 20% price increase. That is scary. If I'm a sales rep, I'm looking at that petrified that I'm virtually guaranteed to lose that business. So now what if we can use analytics to mine our quote data and also web scrape pricing from, e-commerce sites, our main competitors or whoever's selling these things. And then you learn through these pricing analytics using data you've already got and sourcing this external data that the market will actually support a price of $150. That your nearest competitor for an equivalent product is selling it at $150. All of a sudden that $120 doesn't look nearly as risky. So while you haven't technically mitigated risk per se, you've mitigated the perception of risk in the mind of the person that is responsible for selling that price increase. That's the one thing I've learned, is that if somebody doesn't believe that a price increase is justified or that they can sell it, they have an extremely difficult time selling that. So that's an example of, those are two examples of how analytics can help mitigate different types of risk, both real and perceived risk.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.